The morning my lawyer walked into my youngest daughter's kitchen, I watched 63 years of choices crystallize into a single moment. My oldest son's jaw went slack. My second son's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. And my daughter, the one who had given me her own bed and sold her grandmother's ring to buy my medication, simply looked at me with those steady brown eyes and said, "Dad, are you okay?" That was the difference, right there, in that one question, while her brothers were already calculating. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got to that kitchen table, because the road there was the longest 3 weeks of my life, and I built highways for a living. My name is Walter Greer. I spent 34 years building Greer Civil Engineering into something real. We paved roads in 6 states, put up bridges that are still standing, employed over 200 people at our peak. I wasn't born with money. My father was a mechanic in Dayton, Ohio, and my mother cleaned houses on the east side of town until her knees gave out. Everything I built with my hands first and my mind second. I understood what it meant to be tired in a way that lives in your bones. I raised 3 children. My oldest son, Richard, I put through Wharton. My middle son, Daniel, went to Georgetown for law. My daughter, Claire, got a nursing degree from a state school. Her choice. She said she wanted something practical, something that helped people. I was proud of all 3 of them. I thought I had done everything right. Then, on a Tuesday in October, my cardiologist told me the blockages were worse than the previous scan showed. He used words like significant risk and quality of life, and we need to have a serious conversation about your options. I was 63 years old, sitting in a paper gown on an exam table, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt genuinely small. I drove home alone. I sat in my driveway for 40 minutes without going inside. The house was too big. It had been too big since my wife, Margaret, passed 4 years ago. She was the one who kept it feeling like something. Without her, it was just square footage and furniture we'd picked out together in a different life. I walked through the front door and stood in the entryway and listened to how quiet it was. And I thought about my children. And I wondered, really wondered, in a way I had never let myself before, whether they loved me or whether they loved what I represented. I want to be clear. That thought shamed me. I pushed it down. These were my children. I had coached Richard's Little League team. I taught Daniel to drive in the parking lot of a grocery store on a Sunday morning. I braided Claire's hair every day before school for 6 years because she said I did it better than her mother. These were not strangers. These were the people I loved most in the world. But the thought kept coming back, quiet, persistent, like a leak in a wall. I had updated my will 3 months before the cardiologist visit. Everything split 3 ways. The business sold, and proceeds divided equally. The house, the investments, the life insurance, all of it. Shared. I had worked with my attorney, a man named Gerald Finch, who had been my lawyer for 20 years, to make sure everything was clean and fair. Richard and Daniel each knew, in general terms, that the estate was substantial. Claire had never asked. That detail that Claire had never asked sat with me in the quiet house. I made a decision that I told no one about. Not Gerald, not my doctor, not my old friend Ray, who had been my business partner for 15 years before he retired to Scottsdale. I made the decision alone, the way you make decisions when the house is quiet and you're not sure how much time you have left to ask the questions that matter. I was going to find out who my children actually were. I withdrew cash, not a dramatic amount, just $300. Enough to seem real, but not enough to be comfortable. I took off my watch. My father's watch, actually a Seiko, that he wore every day for 20 years, and left to me when he died. I put it in the safe. I dressed in clothes from the back of my closet. A flannel shirt that had seen better days, work pants that were genuinely worn, boots that I'd kept because I couldn't throw away something that had walked that many miles with me. I looked in the bathroom mirror, and I saw an old man who looked tired, because I was an old man who was tired, and that was enough. I called Gerald and told him what I was doing. I told him to wait for my call. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Walter, are you sure?" I said, "Yes." He said, "All right, I'll be ready." The first night was the hardest. Not because of any particular cruelty, but because of the specific, surgical nature of being dismissed by someone who carries your blood. Richard lives in a suburb of Philadelphia. A beautiful house, 5 bedrooms, a kitchen that cost more than my first car, a wine cellar he had built after his company went public. I had helped him with the down payment on that house. Not a loan. A gift. Because he was my son and I wanted him to have a good start. I knocked on his door at 7 in the evening on a Thursday. I had driven there in a rental car and parked 2 streets over. When Richard opened the door, he looked at me the way you look at someone who shows up unexpectedly and inconveniently. Not unkind at first, just measured. Calculating the disruption. I told him what I had rehearsed. That something had happened with the business accounts. A legal complication I couldn't explain fully yet. And that I needed a place to stay for a few days while things got sorted out. That I didn't have access to my cards. That I had some cash, but not much. He asked me how much. That was the first question. Not are you all right? Not come in, sit down. How much? I told him I had about $200. He glanced back into the house. I could hear the television. I could smell something cooking. His wife, Sandra, appeared at the end of the hallway, and I raised my hand, and she gave me a small wave that meant nothing, and disappeared again. Richard said there was a Marriott, about 4 miles down the road. He said he'd Venmo me enough for a few nights. He said things were hectic with the kids, and the timing was really not great. He said it like he was apologizing for a scheduling conflict, like I was a meeting he needed to reschedule. I said, "It's all right, son. Don't worry about it." He sent me $200 through an app while I was still standing on his porch. He told me to keep him posted on the business situation. He closed the door before I reached the bottom of the steps. I sat in the rental car for a long time. The radio was off. The street was nice and quiet, and the houses all had lights on, and I thought about the fact that I had taught that man to ride a bicycle in a parking lot in Dayton, Ohio, and I had cried when he graduated from Wharton, genuinely cried, out of pride and joy, and something that felt like completion. And tonight he had sent me $200 through his phone and closed the door. I did not go to the Marriott. I found a diner that was open late, and I ordered coffee, and I sat there until nearly midnight. The woman behind the counter refilled my cup 3 times without being asked. She was maybe 50, tired around the eyes, and she called me hun, which my mother used to do and which hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for. The second night, I drove to Daniel's apartment in Washington. He had made partner at his firm 2 years ago. He wore suits that cost more than a month of my father's salary. He had dated the same woman for 4 years, and when I asked him once, when they were getting married, he laughed like I had said something charmingly old-fashioned. I told him the same story I had told Richard. A problem with the accounts. A legal complication. Just a few days. Daniel is a lawyer, so he asked better questions. He asked what kind of complication. He asked if I had called Gerald. He asked if there was liability exposure. He was thorough. He was professional. He treated my apparent financial crisis with the same detached precision he probably brought to his client intake meetings. He did not offer me a place to stay. His apartment had a second bedroom. I had stayed there once, 2 years before, when I was in Washington for a conference. He did not mention it. He offered to make some calls. He gave me the name of a firm that handled emergency asset protection. He told me I should document everything. He handed me $100 in cash, which he pulled from his wallet with the deliberate care of someone who has decided the amount in advance. I said, "Thank you, son." He said, "Let me know what Gerald says." I said I would. He closed the door. It was a heavy door, solid wood, the kind that closes with a sound of finality. I stood in the hallway of his building for a moment. The carpet was dark green. The lighting was the yellowish kind that makes everyone look a little unwell. I thought about the day Daniel passed the bar exam, how he had called me first, before his friends, before his girlfriend, how his voice had cracked just slightly, and he had said, "Dad, I did it." And there was something in those 3 words that I had carried with me ever since, like a small, warm stone. I wondered where that person was, the one who called me first. I drove south on 95 for 2.5 hours. It was almost midnight when I pulled up in front of a small house in a town called Kellerton in Southern Virginia. A ranch house with vinyl siding, a truck in the driveway with a magnetic sign on the door that read, "Hartwell Electrical Licensed and Insured." A light was on in the front room. Claire and her husband, Tom, have lived in that house for 6 years. Tom is an electrician. He grew up in the same county where they live now. He is not a man of great ambition in the way the world usually measures ambition. He does not want to expand his business or move to a bigger market or build something large. He wants to do good work, come home to his family, coach his son Marcus's soccer team, and sleep well. I have always respected him. Margaret loved him immediately and completely, which was enough for me. I knocked on the door, and Claire opened it, and when she saw me, the clothes, the absence of the watch, the look on my face that I hadn't entirely managed to control, she didn't ask a single preliminary question. She opened the door wider and said, "Come in, Dad. Come in right now." That was it. That was the whole greeting. "Come in, Dad. Come in right now." Tom was in the living room with his feet up, watching something on television. He stood when I came through the door, stood up immediately, the way men from his background stand when something requires their full presence. Claire told him quietly what I had told her. The same story. The account problem. A few days. Tom nodded once and said, "Guest room's made up. You want something to eat? I made chili earlier. There's plenty." I said I was fine. He said, "Walter, it's late and you drove a long way. Sit down. I'll heat it up." I sat down. The chili was not remarkable in any culinary sense. It was the kind of chili that comes from a recipe that someone's mother made and that gets made on cold nights without ceremony or intention to impress. It was hot and filling, and Tom sat across from me while I ate it, and we talked about nothing important. His work, a job he was doing rewiring an old-school building in the next county, how Marcus had scored his first goal of the season last weekend. He didn't ask about the money. He didn't ask when things would be sorted out. He just sat there like a man who has all the time in the world, which I think is the rarest quality there is. Claire came in after Marcus was settled for the night and sat at the table with us, and the three of us talked until past 1 in the morning. At some point, she reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said, "It's going to be okay, Dad." Not as a prediction, just as a fact she had decided to hold on to on my behalf. They gave me the guest room. It had a quilt on the bed that Margaret had made. Claire had asked for it after her mother died, and I had given it to her, without understanding why she wanted it so badly, until right then, lying under it in the dark, feeling the weight of it in a way that meant something I don't quite have the language for. I stayed 4 days. On the second day, while Tom was at work and Marcus was at school, Claire and I sat on the back porch with coffee, and she told me about a problem she'd been having, nothing catastrophic, just the ordinary grinding difficulty of a household trying to stay ahead of expenses, a medical bill from Marcus's broken arm in August, a repair on Tom's truck that had run over budget. She didn't tell me as a complaint. She told me the way you tell someone when they're sitting with you in the morning quiet, and there's no reason to pretend. I said nothing. I just listened. On the third day, I overheard a phone call. Claire didn't know I was in the hallway. She was in the kitchen, talking quietly, and I heard her say the words, "Grandma's ring, and it should cover it," and then a pause, and I know, but he needs medication, and he doesn't have his cards right now. Another pause. Tom already knows. Yes, I'm sure. I stood in that hallway, and I did not move for a very long time. My mother-in-law, Margaret's mother, had worn a ring every day of her adult life. A small sapphire in a gold setting. Nothing extravagant, deeply meaningful. When she died, she left it to Margaret. When Margaret died, it passed to Claire. It was the only piece of jewelry Claire owned that she never took off. I had noticed it was gone from her finger that morning, and I had not asked. She had sold it. For my medication. For a situation she believed was temporary and desperate. She had sold the one physical object that connected her to her mother and her grandmother, and she had done it without being asked and without telling me. I went to the bathroom and I turned on the fan, and I stood at the sink, and I cried in a way I had not cried since the night Margaret died. Not grief exactly. Something more complex. A kind of breaking open. That evening, Tom came home from the job site with dirt on his hands and a six-pack under his arm, and he stood at the grill in the backyard, cooking burgers while Marcus ran circles in the grass, and I sat in a lawn chair watching, and I thought, this is wealth. This is what it actually is. Not the wine cellar, not the Georgetown law degree. This, A man who stands at a grill after a long day because feeding his family is a pleasure and not an obligation, and a child who runs in circles for no reason other than that he is 7 and the evening is cool and life is good. I called Gerald that night from the back porch, while the house was settling into quiet. I told him I was ready. He said he'd drive down the following morning. I didn't sleep much. I lay under Margaret's quilt, and I thought about Richard closing his door and Daniel handing me cash from his wallet with the careful deliberateness of a man who has already decided on an amount. I thought about Claire saying, "Come in right now," before she knew a single detail. I thought about the ring. I had already made my decision before the 3 weeks started. The will was already written. But there is a difference between making a decision in an attorney's office and understanding, in your bones, why the decision is right. That night, I understood. Gerald arrived at 9:30 in the morning. He knocked on the front door, and Claire answered it, and I watched from the kitchen doorway as her face shifted through several registers, confusion, then something like a held breath, then a careful stillness, as Gerald introduced himself and said he was there to see me. I had asked Richard and Daniel to come. I had called them the night before, from a different phone, and told them I needed them to come to Claire's address for something important regarding the family estate. Richard had said he could rearrange his morning. Daniel had said he'd take the train. Neither had asked if I was all right. Neither had mentioned the visit, or the door, or the money handed out on the porch. They arrived within 20 minutes of each other. When they walked in and saw me sitting at the kitchen table in different clothes, with my watch back on my wrist, looking not like a man whose accounts were frozen, but like a man who was waiting for a specific moment, I watched their faces do the work of recalculating. Richard said, "Dad, what's going on?" Daniel said, "Is this what is this?" Claire, who did not fully understand what was happening, just stood at the counter with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug and watched me. I asked everyone to sit down. Gerald set his briefcase on the table and opened it and took out a folder. And I took a breath and told them everything. I told them about the cardiologist appointment and the October afternoon in my driveway and the question that had come to me in the quiet house and would not leave. I told them about the rental car and the flannel shirt and the Seiko in the safe. I told them about Richard's porch and Daniel's hallway and the drive south on 95 inches, the middle of the night. I told it plainly. I am not a dramatic man by nature. I did not perform it. I just told the truth in the order it happened, the way you'd tell it to someone who needed to know. Richard's face went through several things rapidly. I recognized the sequence because I had watched him play poker once at a family gathering, and he had the same tells. First the calculation, then something defensive, then a kind of resetting. Daniel was very still. He has a courtroom stillness, a trained absence of reaction. But I know my son, and underneath it, I could see something working. Claire had set down her coffee mug. She was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, not hurt, not angry, something more like witness, like she was holding what she'd heard very carefully. Gerald opened the folder and laid out the documents and explained what they said with the quiet efficiency of a man who has had difficult conversations for many years and has learned to let the facts carry their own weight. The estate, he explained, had been reorganized. The business had been sold. The sale had actually completed 4 months prior, which was information I had not shared with my children. The total liquid assets, combined with the property and investments, represented a substantial sum. Gerald named the number carefully, watching the room as he did. Richard made a sound that was not quite a word. Daniel's stillness broke for just a moment, a quick blink, and then came back. The distribution, Gerald continued, was as follows. 2 trusts had been established, one for Richard and one for Daniel, each funded with a specific sum. It was not a small amount, but it was not the full division they had imagined. The remainder, the substantial majority, had been placed in a trust administered for Claire and her family, along with a direct fund for Marcus's education and a provision for Tom's business, if he ever chose to expand it. There was also, Gerald added, looking directly at Claire, a separate account earmarked specifically to replace a sapphire ring of sentimental value that had recently been sold. He slid a printed bank confirmation across the table. The amount was enough to have it remade exactly. Claire looked at the paper. She looked at me. She said nothing. Her eyes were very bright. Richard found his voice first. He said that he thought the estate was to be split evenly. He said it with the careful neutrality of a man who knows he is in dangerous territory but cannot quite stop himself. I said, yes, that was the original plan. He waited. I said, plans change when you learn things you didn't know. He started to say something about the circumstances, about how things had looked from his perspective, about the stress his household had been under. I held up my hand. Not to silence him, I want to be precise about this, but because what I had to say next needed to come out without interruption, and I had thought about how to say it for 3 weeks, lying in a guest room in a house where the electricity worked because of the man sleeping down the hall. I said, I am not punishing you. I want you to hear that. I am not punishing you. You are my son, and I love you, and that does not change tonight or on any other night. But love and inheritance are different things. Inheritance is not a reward for being born. It is a recognition of character. It is a man saying, here is what I built, and here is who I trust with what it means. I looked at Daniel and said the same applied. The trust I had set up for him was enough to make his life easier in real ways. He was not losing. He was receiving what I, in my considered judgment, believed reflected his relationship to the values that had built what I was distributing. I looked at Claire. I said, I watched your husband heat up chili at midnight for a man who showed up at your door looking like something the highway left behind. I heard a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. I know about the ring. She pressed her lips together and looked down at the table. I said, your mother would have done the same thing. She would have opened the door before I finished knocking, and she would have had coffee going before I sat down. You are exactly who she raised you to be, and I am exactly as proud of you as she would have been. And I need you to know that with the same certainty, you know your own name. Tom, who had come in quietly during Gerald's explanation and was standing near the kitchen doorway, with his arms crossed and his face unreadable, cleared his throat once. Just once. The room was quiet for a long time after that. Richard left before noon. He was not cruel about it. He kissed my cheek at the door and said he'd call me. And I believe he will, and I believe the call will be genuine. Because underneath everything, Richard is not a bad person. He is a person who let comfort build walls so gradually that he stopped noticing they were there. That is a more common failing than evil, and a more repairable one. I have hope for him. Daniel stayed a little longer. He sat with me at the table after Gerald left, after Claire had taken Marcus to soccer practice, after Tom had gone back to his truck. Just the two of us, at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us. He said, I should have let you in. I said, yes. He said, I didn't think, and then stopped. I said, I know. That's what I needed to understand. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he said, she's always been different from us. He didn't say it meanly. He said it the way you say something you're only now fully understanding. I said, she's always been herself. That's not the same as different. He nodded slowly. Then he said, the ring. When did you find out? I told him. He was quiet. Then he said, I gave her $100. I said, I know. He said, that was wrong. I said, it was. He said nothing else for a while. We sat there and the coffee went completely cold, and outside a neighbor's dog barked at something, and the afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor the way it does in October when the angle is going low and the days are short. Eventually he stood, and I stood, and he hugged me in a way he hadn't hugged me since he was a child. Both arms, no pat on the back, just holding on for a second longer than habit would suggest. He said he'd call. I said I knew. He left. Claire came home with Marcus an hour later, and Marcus ran into the house and said, Grandpa, with the specific force of a 7-year-old who has had a good practice and is full of energy and love and news about a save he made in goal. I caught him and I held him, and I thought about how this child, running into a house where the lights work because his father wired them with his own hands and the quilt on the guest bed came from his great-grandmother, is growing up in the middle of something true. He will know what his mother is. He will know what his father is. He will have that knowledge the way I had it. From a man in Dayton who was a mechanic, and who left me a watch and whose hands I can still see if I close my eyes. That evening, the four of us ate dinner together. Tom made something from a cast iron pan, something with chicken and vegetables and too much black pepper, and it was excellent. Marcus told a story about a kid at school that went on too long and had no discernible point and was completely riveting. Claire laughed at something Tom said with the ease of two people who have laughed together long enough that it requires no effort. The kitchen was warm. I sat at that table and I thought about the cardiologist's office and the paper gown and the word significant. I thought about sitting in my driveway for 40 minutes in October with the engine off. I thought about the fact that I had been looking for something in the quiet of that house for 4 years, since Margaret left, and I had not known what I was looking for. And now I knew. I was looking for evidence. Evidence that the life we had built had left something behind that mattered. Evidence that the values I had tried to live by and tried to pass on had taken root somewhere, in someone, in some way that would outlast me. I had found it. It was sitting across the table, arguing with a 7-year-old about whether or not a kid named Tyler had actually said what Marcus claimed he said. Marcus looked at me from across the table and said, "Grandpa, are you staying for a while?" I looked at Claire. She raised her eyebrows in a way that meant I could say whatever I wanted. I said, "Yeah, buddy, for a little while." He said, "Good, because Dad said maybe you could help coach soccer." Tom said, from behind his water glass. I said, "Maybe." I said, "I don't know anything about soccer." Marcus said, "That's okay. Dad doesn't either." Tom pointed at him. "That is genuinely not true." Claire laughed and covered her face with her hand, and I felt something in my chest that the cardiologist cannot measure, a kind of warmth that has nothing to do with blockages or blood pressure or any of the numbers that have been worrying me since October. I am 63 years old. I built roads and bridges for 34 years. I raised 3 children, and I got 2 of them wrong in ways I am still trying to understand my part in. I lost my wife 4 years ago, and I have not fully recovered from that, and I suspect I never entirely will. And I have made peace with that the way you make peace with something that is simply true. But I am sitting in a kitchen in Kellerton, Virginia, with a quilt made by my wife's hands in the guest room down the hall, and a 7-year-old who wants me to help coach soccer, and a daughter who sold her grandmother's ring without being asked, and a son-in-law who heated up chili at midnight and never mentioned it again. I have a doctor's appointment next month to discuss the next steps. I am going to ask Claire to come with me, if she's willing. She is a nurse. She will ask the right questions and remember the answers, and drive me home and probably make me eat something sensible afterward. She will not make it a transaction. She will just be there, the way she has always been there, the way her mother was there. That is what I have. That is everything. I know men who have more than I have. I know men who have larger estates and more impressive children and names on buildings. I do not envy them in the way I might have once. I have been in enough empty hallways now to know that a name on a building is just stone, and stone does not sit with you at midnight while you eat chili that is too spicy, and stone does not laugh with its hand over its face, and stone does not say, "Come in right now," before it knows a single detail. Richard will call. I believe that. Daniel hugged me in a way that meant something, and I am going to choose to believe that the something it meant is the beginning of a longer conversation. I am their father. I am not done with them, and they are not done with me, and whatever we become to each other next, we will figure out. But tonight, the cast iron pan is soaking in the sink, and Marcus has been put to bed twice, and the third time it's stuck. And Tom is in the living room watching something with the sound low, and Claire is sitting at the kitchen table across from me, with both hands around a mug of decaf. And she says, quietly, "Dad, are you okay?" And I say yes. And I mean it in a way I have not meant it in a long time. And outside, the October dark is full, and the town of Kellerton is quiet, and somewhere under that sky, Richard is driving north, and Daniel is on a train, and my father's watch is on my wrist where it belongs, ticking the way it has ticked since Dayton, Ohio, since a man with grease under his fingernails wound it every morning before he went to work because that was the kind of man he was. I wind it now, too. Every morning, I finally understand why.